Our next speaker is Dr. Jim Bentley. Jim Bentley is the Executive Chief Officer of the New South Wales Water Sector and Deputy Secretary of Water, New South Wales, the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, DPI. DPI are one of our partners in there, so we're very thrilled to have Jim be able to talk today. He was formerly Managing Director of Hunter Water Corporation in New South Wales, and he's got a lot of global experience in infrastructure services, but particularly in the water industry. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim to talk today.
Thanks very much for that introduction. And it's always daunting following someone like Hugh, who's got a brain the size of a planet and probably knows half of my portfolio better than I do, especially when he talked about water a lot. So I sort of feel the pressure's on me now to say something helpful and useful about water from an uncertainty point of view. One of the issues we have with the water sector, I think, is that it's a very conservative sector. It's a sector that fears risk, and any sign of risk is a bad thing. And the people who have been educated to work in this sector, typically over their sort of tertiary education and in the training they undergo in the early stages of their career, risk is something to be feared, uncertainty is something to be feared, and our job is to create certainty. And of course, there are certain areas where risk reduction is really important. And Hugh mentioned a few things like PFAS, for example. I remember early in my days at Hunter Water being bombarded with newspaper reports and questions from various sources about the PFAS risk that we were facing. And indeed, our scientists at Hunter Water had done an analysis because of the Williamtown contamination of the risk that we would be facing to the public water supply. And unfortunately wrote a report that talked about the very high risk to public health from PFAS contamination. And of course, the risk was actually extremely low, because the part of the bore field that was exposed to PFAS contamination could be completely isolated and eliminated. But loose language and a fear of risk and a fear of uncertainty led to a lot of concern in the community and in the media. And again, Hugh referred to engagement of community. Community has expectations of us when we're talking about natural resources like water, that we're not going to be leaving them with lots of uncertainty about whether they can trust us or not. And I think because of that, that has left a lot of our professionals in our sector with this fear of uncertainty. And one of the phrases Hugh used as well was, he said, maybe an embracement of uncertainty. And I think absolutely, in this sector, we need to learn to embrace the right kind of uncertainty. A few examples I've come across in my career where I think this obsession with certainty, rather than embracing uncertainty, has led to problems. Some years ago, I worked for an economics firm that was doing livelihoods projects in very poor parts of the world. And I inherited a large project in Bangladesh, where we had to work to grow the livelihoods of some of the world's poorest people living on islands in the river. And the average age of these islands, the average life of these islands was about 6 years, because the island formed from the riverbed being stirred up by the snow melt that happened from the Himalayas. And so these islands got formed, and then they lasted about 6 years and disappeared. So And the distance from these islands to the mainland was several kilometers. And you had, I think it was 1.5, 2 million people living on these islands. You couldn't give them any kind of land right or any kind of property because it was going to disappear in a few years' time. And we had to work to try and improve their livelihoods. One of the, where this comes into this uncertainty thing, one of the things that we did for these people was we flood-proofed to some degree the houses that they lived in. These houses were very simple tin sheds, shall we say. And what we did is we took the shed down, we piled sand up to be much higher, so that when the floods came through, their house was protected from the flood. That doesn't sound like a terribly difficult thing to do. I couldn't work out from London, where I was then working, why the money wasn't flowing to Bangladesh to solve these problems. And I had several trips out there and kept setting targets. And what do you do as a CEO or a project manager or whatever? You just keep setting more targets and then whip people even harder for not meeting the targets. Alternatively, you try and understand what's going on. So eventually I turned my mind to that bit. And as I looked around the village, I saw that there would be 2 or 3 houses in a row that had this flood protection applied. Then there'd be one that hadn't, and then there'd be another one that had. And when I was talking to the team about what was happening here, I said, why have you got 3 that are done or 2 that are done, then not one, and then one that is? And the answer was, well, the people in that house are sufficiently wealthy that they should be able to pay to raise the height of their own house. And therefore, there's a risk that we won't be repaid by the government of the UK, which was our client, for flood-proofing their house. This concern about the uncertainty about whether we would get paid or not, the uncertainty about whether or not these people were sufficiently poor, actually meant that most people didn't get their houses protected quickly enough. And so the risk to everyone increased because of the fear of uncertainty over something and this obsession with making sure we could calculate the risk properly, and the risk to that person wasn't worth raising the height of their house. It really confronted me with this thought about, an obsession with risk and an obsession with the fear of uncertainty can actually lead to a much worse risk situation than we had envisaged. Some examples a bit closer to the field of water, shall we say. One of the things that surprised me in the last few years, there's a small town in New Zealand, Havelock North, and there was contamination of the water supply in Havelock North from very simple failings of simple asset management practice. And people died, and many hundreds of people were made quite seriously ill because the asset management of these boreholes and so on wasn't sufficiently looked after. But in the day-to-day decision-making that people are doing, their judgment about the risk of something happening to the water supply was that, well, we've been doing this for 50 years, for 60 years, for 80 years, and nothing's gone wrong. And so they just carried on doing the wrong things. And their sort of misjudgment, I think, around what is certain and what is uncertain, what is risky and what isn't risky, actually led to people dying because very simple things weren't done. Because something hadn't happened for a long time, it wouldn't happen. So again, I think a complete misunderstanding of what's certain and what is uncertain. And it's quite similar to, I lived in Turkey for a few years, and I ran Thames Water's major investment in about an hour and a half's drive east of Istanbul, where we had a large water supply project, which that city was hit by a very large earthquake in 1999, and very sadly 15,000 people died. Well, I was responsible for the bulk water supply for that town, and some of the villages in that area didn't receive their water from us, but had their own bores. And we went around those villages and talked to the village elders, because we said, their water had never been treated in any way. And when we talked to them and said, look, the risk has changed very significantly because we've had this big earthquake and the ground's moved. And the village elders were saying to me, we've been drinking this water for 6 generations. It's never been treated. You can't put chemicals in our water. And we were left with this very difficult judgment around, should we be trying to create certainty or protection, or should we be allowing them to live with the uncertainty that they are choosing to live with, when that uncertainty was actually based on a false understanding of the risk of the situation. So I think in the world of water, we face these things around what is certain and what is uncertain, and what type of uncertainty should we be embracing, and what type of uncertainty should we be trying to manage away. When I first arrived in the Hunter, I was faced with a situation where my staff came to me and said, the supply and demand curves for Greater Newcastle cross in 20 years' time. And that means we need to build a new dam or a large desal plant that's operational within 20 years. And they were very confident of their facts because they could show me the demand projections, full of uncertainty, of course. And they could show me the historic trend, and they could show me the theoretical yield from their dam system, full of uncertainty, of course. Yet these lines crossed at a certain point in time, and they showed me where that point crosses the timeline, and they said, right, in 20 years we need this. And I remember being very, very confused by this situation. How were we taking such uncertain models about the reliable yield from our system, about what the climate was going to do, about what population was going to do, about what customer behavior was going to do in terms of how much water people would use, about how well we could actually manage our system to get rid of leakage and so on. Yet we were making very firm recommendations, we need this within 20 years. And they also said that to get that operational within 20 years, we would need to make a decision in 5 years, because the planning approvals we'd have to go through, the time it would take, it was going to be a dam to build a dam, for the dam to fill, and so on and so forth. We've got 5 years to make a decision. So I said, answer me a few questions. What's our leakage in the system like? And nobody knew the answer to the question, which I found quite frustrating, that the very people who were recommending to me that we should be building something didn't know that part of the system. Anyway, they ran along and looked it up, and they came back. It turned out we had the worst leakage of any significant city in Australia. Now, it wasn't Thames Water in London kind of standards. When I worked there, it was more than 25% leakage in London. I don't think it's much better now. It is a bit better. It is improving. But it was the worst leakage in Australia. And I said, well, what contribution could getting leakage down to a world breaking level make? And then there was, then I asked the question, what's our per capita consumption? How much water do our customers actually use? And they went away and had a look at it. And we weren't the worst in Australia. We were about sort of in the middle. But it turns out our customers were using about 25% more water than Melbourne customers. And we had quite interesting conversations about, yes, we see what you don't understand is the weather's different in Newcastle to Melbourne. And we're nearer the sea, so we use more water for washing our surfboards and our boats and all these sorts of things. And actually an examination of the data shows us that in Sydney and in Newcastle before the millennium drought, we all used about the same amount of water per person. And during the millennium drought, particularly Sydney and Melbourne reduced their per capita consumption really quite significantly. Then Melbourne carried on reducing further and Sydney sort of plateaued. And we ended up with a situation in Newcastle and in Sydney, we were using 25 to 30% more than Melbourne, but we were celebrating the fact that demand had come down during the millennium drought and isn't that great, ignoring the fact that somewhere else demand had carried on falling quite significantly. So we were uncertain about what we could get our leakage down to, uncertain about what customer behaviour we could change. We were uncertain, obviously, about climate and weather and population growth and all those sorts of things. But we seem to be very definite about in 20 years' time, we need a dam of this size or a desal plant of this size. And we had to make that decision in 5 years. So I put to the team that rather than trying to build away risk and build away uncertainty by committing to building a very large asset, why don't we accept there's a value to keeping our options open, because we don't know what we could achieve in the next few years. And we set ourselves the task of saying, well, how far could we grow our window of opportunity to see what behaviour change is achievable, what technology could do in terms of the amount of water people need to use in their homes, what we could get our leakage levels down to, and so on. And I'm really proud to say Hunter Water, by embracing that period of uncertainty and agreeing that there's a value in keeping our options open, have really made a dent in per capita consumption, and they've turned their leakage around. I think their leakage is reduced by 24% in 3 years, which is pretty remarkable. But without valuing uncertainty or being able to being prepared to take on some uncertainty, or as in the language that I used at Hunter Water, saying there's a value in keeping our options open, we would have just plowed ahead and built a big asset. And one of the things that concerns me is that we would probably not have been criticised for that. We would have got some criticism from people who didn't want the asset built in the local region. In the industry, people would have accepted that the lines crossed on that graph at a certain moment in time, and the sensible risk management thing to do would be to build that asset. Now, Hunter Water probably will still need to build some bulk supply infrastructure over the next few years or in the coming period. The thing is now they have a much better idea about what sort of size it needs to be, what sort of time it needs to be available. And they've been adaptive in the way that they've managed their system without taking terrible amounts of risk to the supply situation. And I think here is an example of embracing uncertainty has really paid off to the benefit of the community and the benefit of the environment, because we haven't built kit bigger than or earlier than we need it. And we've learned to live with and embrace uncertainty without loading pressure on our communities. I just want to refer to one or two other situations where I think this uncertainty thing is important. If we look in Sydney, when we were very fortunate that it rained in February and we've got storages still above 80%. That's obviously a much better situation than when we were in, when we got, I think storage fell to about 43% until about February. But in that drought, when dam levels are getting low, and of course the pressure's on, there was a lot of talk about how much climate independent source do we need for Sydney. And there's so many uncertainties in the modelling and in the judgments around that. And it's billions and billions of dollars worth of decision. And this happened in southeast Queensland with the Millennium Drought, where they built several large water recycling factories, or whatever you want to call them, and they were mothballed because it rained. Well, that happens. And if we're going to live with uncertainty, we have to accept that some of our predictions are going to be wrong. But it's a massive question for Sydney, and it's a really important one. What is the level of either desalination or recycled water use that we need to give us independence from the climate? We need to understand uncertainty to be able to make good decisions there. And the swing in those decisions is billions and billions of dollars. One other water-related thing I just wanted to point to was in the river systems. Hugh referred to the Barwon-Darling system and the Murray-Darling Basin, and those things give me a lot of joy in my life, as you can probably imagine. But we introduced this year in February, again, I think it was, for the first time, we embargoed floodplain harvesting for the first flush of rain. And as a result of that, we were able to shepherd, if you like, water through to Menindee Lakes, and there is a connected river system for the first time in 2 years. But it's for the first time ever that we managed to embargo floodplain harvesting, which meant that more of the water was able to get down to Menindee. But in the management of that event, we had to make decisions in a live here and now 24/7 sense about whether there were situations in which we should lift the embargo to protect property or to minimise risk of harm to people because of where floodwaters could go. And a lot of uncertainty in the judgments that our people had to make at that time. And of course, post the event, it's very easy to point to that and say, well, you didn't get this bit right or you didn't get that bit right. But going back to Hugh's point before, the quality of engagement with community is absolutely critical in how we plan for those kind of events, but also in the management of those kind of events, and how we communicate with community about the uncertainty we're dealing with in the management of such an event, I think is something that we could really use some help with. And it's a really important issue for us. Just one piece of work that I think I would like to just draw to your attention. When I first started working with colleagues at University College London, I came across a guy called Professor Harry Demetrio from the Omega Centre. And the Omega Centre did a study of a lot of very large infrastructure projects. These happen to be transport infrastructure projects. I think there were about 20. They were all £1 billion plus projects. There were some in Australia and some in Europe, different parts of the world, and local universities were involved with the Omega Centre in studying them. Anyway, through a process of storytelling and interviews and things like that, they synthesised the findings from what made a successful mega project. Now, I used to work in the civil engineering department. I've worked in the world of infrastructure for years and years. And some of my colleagues would have been horrified to see how drawn I was to Harry's work, because one of the things he talked about, that one of the factors in a really successful mega project is when you place a value on emergent objectives, or in other words, don't pin down the objectives of your project before you have to. Live with uncertainty for a period of time. Because this obsession we have with trying to create certainty too quickly, we might all feel better because we know what we're going to achieve, but we may have managed out the opportunity to achieve something even better.